Rabbi Berman is considered one of the leading modern Orthodox teachers and thinkers in the US. And I personally have a long relationship with him, and it's really a zchut to have him here today. Rabbi Berman was ordained from Yeshiva University, and he also received his BA and MHL there. He completed a degree in law at NYU and an MA in political science at the University of California at Berkeley. Rabbi Berman spent 2 years studying Mishpat Ivri in Israel at Hebrew University and Tel Aviv University. And what's important for you to know is that Rabbi Berman is a major advocate and a contributor to the growth of women's Jewish education for decades. And he also has contributed significantly to the role that social ethics plays in synagogue life. He's made significant contributions to the understanding of the applicability of Jewish law to contemporary society. So it's really a zchut to have him with us today. And Rabbi Berman, I'm handing over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So it's my pleasure to be here, Rav Har'el. It's a pleasure to see you and to have an opportunity to learn with all of you. So there'll be really two parts to the conversation that I would like to have with you today. Both of those parts are constructed out of an approach to the understanding of halakha that builds out of the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim in book 3, the bulk of book 3 really, certainly in chapters 17 and later on, in which the Rambam has a fundamental argument with Saadia Gaon around the question of whether all of the mitzvot of the Torah serve human purpose. Right, you're all familiar with that. With that debate, Saadia Gaon had maintained that some mitzvot of the Torah serve human purpose, but that others are not, serve no necessary rational purpose, but they are fundamentally what he, his use of the term chukim to create a classification of mitzvot which are essentially irrational, not irrational, but irrational. That do not serve any particular rational purpose, but that fundamentally serve some purpose in demonstrating human obedience to the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is, that while some of the mitzvot of the Torah, according to Saadia, emerge from Chokhmat Hashem, from God's wisdom as to the nature of the human being, that there are mitzvot of the Torah that are fundamentally purely Ratzon Hashem. That's it. Those are the Ratzon Hashem, and we can't ultimately have any really serious understanding of those mitzvot because they are not designed out of principles of Chokhmah. They are simply the Ratzon Hashem, and we are obligated to accept them. Rambam takes fundamental issue with that approach. And the Rambam maintains that every one of the mitzvot of the Torah is the product of Chokhmat Hashem. And that every mitzvah of the Torah, every one of Taryag mitzvot, serves some human purpose. And that while there may be some mitzvot of the Torah that we have difficulty in sort of figuring out what that human purpose is, that doesn't mean that they have no human purpose. It just means that we have not yet been able to figure out what the human purpose is. And that while the Rambam concedes that there may be some levels of detail of implementation of the law, which are arbitrary, like, for example, the sprinkling of blood related to korbanot, and whether blood has to be sprinkled above the center of the mizbeach or below the center of the mizbeach. Okay, those are sort of administrative details, which, according to the Rambam, may not serve any specific purpose because they're simply designed to distinguish between different korbanot, but that fundamentally every single one of Taryag mitzvot serves human purpose. the Rambam goes on to describe in some detail what his framing principles are for that assumption. And the Rambam maintains that every one of the mitzvot of the Torah serves human purpose in one of three ways. Either in helping us to understand some fundamental truth, or correlatively to understand what is false, so that, for example, it is essential for human beings to believe that there is only one God in the world, and that understanding of the world is essential. And so God teaches us that straight out, and informs us that there are forms of worship of a deity which are unacceptable, or for that matter, let's say the Rambam maintains that the teaching of the Torah, that it's impermissible to communicate with the dead, that communication with the dead is forbidden, is, according to the Rambam, a fundamental teaching of a truth, and that is that living human beings do not have the capacity to communicate with dead human beings. That's all as far as the Rambam is concerned. That's a fundamental truth. Obviously, Ramban differs with him about whether that's a fundamental truth or not, but according to the Rambam, there's simply no question about that. That's a fundamental truth, and the Torah teaches us that fundamental truth. And so you have this layer of truths which are central to the teachings of Torah, and which HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals within Torah and provides us with laws that implement those truths. And that's one category of purposes. A second category of purposes, according to the Rambam, is to instruct us in what are the fundamental midot that human beings have to strive to achieve. What are the fundamental personality characteristics that we are obligated to strive to achieve in our being, and conversely to teach us what kinds of characteristics of human beings are corrupt and we need to avoid. And so it's in that sense, Rambam would argue that there are three mitzvot of Ahava in the Torah, and that each of them teach us some fundamental characteristic about what we need to have as a capacity, as a, so to speak, a capacity in our feelings and a capacity in our cognition for the love of Hashem and for the love of Bnei Yisrael and for the love of Gerim. For the Rambam, clearly that means Gerei Toshav, and that that those are fundamentals, and therefore there are many mitzvot of the Torah which are designed to aid us in the implementation of those fundamental virtues. And by contrast, the Torah teaches us that lo tisnat achicha b'levavecha, and some 34 different laws of the Torah. Rabbi Soloveitchik, Zechat Tzaddik was known on frequent occasions to make reference to the fact that there are some 34 different mitzvot of the Torah that are addressed directly to the feeling level, right? To the virtues that an individual needs to strive to achieve and needs to sustain in consciousness, even though many of them are translated in Torah into conduct, that nevertheless they represent sort of the fundamental range of virtues that human beings have to either achieve or avoid in the formation of their religious identity. And so that's a second layer. And then third, and the Rambam maintains that the first two are essential to the creation of the third. That is that human beings have to know what is true and what is false. They have to know what affirmative virtues are, and they have to know what sort of wrongful inner sensibilities are. And all of those taken together lead to a third layer. And that third layer is the achievement of a society in which justice reigns. And that therefore, substantial body of the laws of the Torah are then designed to teach us how to implement justice within human society. Right? And so that's sort of a general framework. And therefore, right, that's how the Torah mandates us, not to kill, and the Torah mandates us not to, not to injure the property of human beings and not to injure their emotional well-being, right? I mean, all of those are part of the the system in which Torah is attempting to provide us with, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is attempting to provide us with the sensibility of what it means to create a just order in society. And the Rambam maintains, and this is his argument, and then of course, as you know, the latter part of the third volume of the third book of the Moreh Nevuchim is in its entirety playing out the fundamentals of the way in which those truths, virtues, and values and social values are actually implemented in the law. And so for the Rambam, every one of the pieces of the law are part of this sort of huge puzzle, designed to enable not just the performance of those actions, but to enable the human being to really know and live one's life in accordance with fundamental truth and avoid falsehood, and to enable individuals to know how to cultivate their inner feelings, their inner state, their virtues, and to avoid sort of corruption of the neshama that is the consequence of the adoption of evil, or the support of evil feelings, and ultimately to thereby achieve social justice, which the Rambam in turn argues becomes necessary in the physical world in order for the first two to be fully accomplished. Right? That is, in the final event, unless society is capable of achieving a just and stable, secure society, that in turn challenges the capacity to form truth and proper virtues, right? So it's like a virtuous cycle, so to speak, in which the understanding of the basic truths, virtues, and values and social values are essential for the formation of a just society, and then the existence of the just society itself feeds into the continued development of the understanding of truths, virtues, and values, and produces what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us ultimately to achieve, and that is lives of fullness, of knowledge, and both cognitively and emotionally in every form, and the integration of all of that through law. Now, I'm going to focus most of the first part of my talk around the question of what does it mean for the Rambam to understand that to be implemented within law? What is the critical nature of law in regard to the implementation of this major scheme of law? Why law? And I want to do that in sort of two stages. One is first by basically looking at biblical law and seeing whether we can discern within the framework of biblical law some of these sort of fundamental truths and how they get implemented into law, and what the challenges are in implementing them into law. What are the challenges, the constraints that exist that limit the capacity to implement these truths, virtues, and values into law, and then I want to look at the way in which the Rambam understands sort of the progressive nature of the way in which all of this gets implemented. Okay, that's sort of my agenda for this hour and a half that we have together. So I want to start with a fundamental assumption, and that is that, which again the Rambam insists, and I'm going to insist on in a slightly different manner. Right? The Rambam insists that the significant portions of the Torah are designed as a war against idolatry. Right? So we're all familiar with that, and the Rambam plays that out in extensive measure in the third book of the guide, in ways that are somewhat surprising. But the fundamental assumption that the Torah is a war against idolatry, and I want to suggest that the Torah is not just a war against idolatrous worship. That the Torah is, in a much broader sense, a war against the totality of idolatrous culture and the way in which idolatrous culture had its own forms, so to speak, of integration of principles and law, and that you can't understand the law of Torah without understanding sort of the countercultural power of the text of Torah itself. And in that regard, I want to look at four different areas, which I sort of outlined for you in my list of makorot in biblical sources. And the first of those is that it is, well documented, and I don't have to, demonstrate that extensively, that the Torah was the first legal system in the history of humanity to insist that the notion of the wrongfulness of the taking of human life applied to every human life. That is, as you can see in some of the sources, for example, that I suggested that you take a look at in Hammurabi's code, for example. Right. So in Hammurabi's code, let's say the material that's before you in Hammurabi's code, in let's say law, whatever it is, in law 7, right, is you find the penalty of death for theft, right? Penalty of death for theft. A person steals something, it's a capital crime to engage in theft of property. In law 8 in Hammurabi's code, if a person steals something and there's a fine, and he's unable to pay, then the thief has to be put to death. In law 116, if the one sees die of blows or of bad treatment in the house of his distrainer, right, because a person could be given, so to speak, as a hostage for the payment of a debt, and if that person died, so if he be the son of a freeborn man, then the son of the merchant shall be put to death. If he be a slave, he shall pay 1/3 of a mina of silver, and he, the distrainer, shall forfeit all that he gave as a loan. So what does that mean in number 116? It means that there's a fundamental distinction between the valuing of the life of a freeborn person as opposed to the life of a slave. That is, if you take the life of a freeborn person, then the payment is someone has to be put to death. Who is to be put to death? The son of the merchant, right? So, there we'll look at that a little bit later on in terms of the issue of vicarious punishment. But right now, what I want to focus on is this other element of this distinction in taking life. It is clear that the taking of human life can be wrongful, but the degree of wrongfulness depends on whose life is taken. The same thing is true in the Hittite code, right? In the Hittite code, in the right-hand column of that page, if you take a look at paragraph 5, right, the penalty is different for every kind of person, depending entirely on the status of the person. The penalty for the crime of homicide depends entirely on the status of the person. So the declaration of Torah, already in chapter 9 of Breshit, of Shofer Dam Ha'adam, Ba'adam Damo Yishafech, constituted a radical departure from the understanding of virtually of all of human history. I mean, you have to remember that slavery in the United States was first abolished in the mid-1800s, right? So up until the 1800s, in the United States of America, right, approximately 3,400 years after Matan Torah, it was still the case that an owner of a slave killing a slave could do so with absolute impunity. And that was the law in virtually every society that recognized the institution of slavery. And that was that the killing of a slave was simply the killing of the destruction of property and did not partake of the law of homicide. It was not killing a human being. The Torah clearly set itself up as a radical alternative to that. From the outset, by declaring that every human being is, as in Bereshit Perek Aleph, descended from a single couple, which means that every human being is invested with Tzelem Elokim. And then by declaring in chapter 9 of Bereshit that Shofech Dam Ha'adam, Ba'adam Damo Yishafech, that taking the life of a human being was the criminal action, was taking the life of a human being. Now, of course, the Torah, in a sense, goes so far beyond that. At the same time, that statute itself of Bereshit chapter 9, pasuk 6, has an inner contradiction in it, right? I mean, if every human life is of equal, inestimable value, then why should the Torah turn around and say that the penalty for the taking of human life is the taking of a human life? Correct? I mean, it's sort of it's a fundamental anomaly. And it's an anomaly that exists in the whole of Torah law related to the absolute insistence that every human being is created b'tzelem Elokim, that therefore this principle of shofech dam adam ba'adam dam yishafech, the principle of lo tirtzach, in its fundamental formulation, as recognized, for example, by Berman in a distinctive way, right? Berman says, Lo tirtzach is not a law, says Berman. Lo tirtzach is a fundamental principle. It's an ultimate value, not a law. All right, but one way or another, there's an anomaly here, clearly an anomaly here, because while the Torah seems to be so extraordinarily insistent on protecting every human life, that same Torah allows capital punishment, right? That same Torah allows conduct of war, some of which is expressed in really extremely rigorous terms. It certainly allows, if not demands, the taking of life in self-defense, right? I mean, so how do we understand the nature of the relationship between this sort of fundamental principle that clearly the Torah is laying out as a countercultural principle in opposition to the way in which every society until modern times understood this notion of not taking human life, right? I mean, Christian society has been around for over close to 2,000 years now, right? And they believe in the 10 Commandments, and they know that the 10 Commandments says lo tirtzach, correct? And nevertheless, Christian society has not found it until modern times anomalous to be engaged in all sorts of actions that involve Christians murdering other Christians, right? Let alone murdering heretics. Well, how do we understand? How do we understand that? In any case, I want to come back to the fundamental nature of this principle of the value of human life, because the distinctiveness of Torah does not only exist in simply the notion that every human being, including, and that's why the Torah, of course, places emphasis on the fact that even the killing of a slave, right? That even the killing of a slave is anoshia anesh. There's a penalty for killing a slave. That penalty resides fundamentally in Noahite law for its implementation, not in Jewish law for its implementation, if it's a non-Jewish slave, right? Because in regard to Jews, the Torah doesn't allow at all the existence of the notion of the ownership of the body. But the Torah itself, for example, in regard to slaves, well, I'll leave this for the next piece. I mean, the Torah clearly insists that every human life every human life is, as it were, protected by shofet dam ha'adam, adam damoy shafech, and by lo tirtzach. But the Torah goes further than that, because the Torah does something that even to this day, Western society has not understood. And that is, the Torah insists that there is no capital punishment for crimes against property. There is no society in the history of humanity which has implemented that principle fully. I mean, I grew up in a period of time when Western movies were very common, right? And in every Western movie, the cattle thief, the rustler, gets hung. And he doesn't get hung because people are simply furious about the fact that someone stole their cattle. He gets killed in judicial process. Because up until the early 1900s, in the Western states of the United States, a person could be killed, put to death by law, because that was the law, put to death for stealing cattle. Torah does not allow someone to be put to death for stealing property, right? The closest you get to that in Torah is the law of machteret, in which a person can be killed, right? In the course of their having broken in someplace and they're attempting to steal in the middle of the night, where the Torah creates a legal presumption that the thief, if you resist him, he will take your life in order to complete his theft of property. So the reason that you can take the life of the burglar who broke into your home at night is not because of the protection of the property, but because of still the protection of human life. It's a self-defense action, which is why if the burglar, and it was clear to Chazal, that if the burglar was already outside your house and running away, and he was up the block already with all of your wealth, that you were not allowed to kill him in order to stop him from the completion of his theft, because he no longer constituted a threat to your life. And you can't kill someone for stealing property. In other words, it was clear that Torah was attempting to establish a set of principles regarding the protection of human life that were absolutely distinctive. That's also why the Torah insists in Bamidbar 35, that you can't allow a murderer to escape the penalty for murder, which is capital punishment. You can't allow him to escape by paying off the family, right? I mean, that's why I included this short this article, right? Did you take a look at that the article? I mean, to this day in Saudi Arabia, the law in Saudi Arabia is that if the family of a victim of homicide is willing to accept a payment, that they can waive the requirement of law that the murderer be put to death, right? Which is exactly what 3,500 years ago the Torah was objecting to. Why was the Torah objecting to that 3,500 years ago? Because 3,500 years ago, the Torah already understood that there is this pattern in human society of viewing human life as property. And that if you view human life as property, then if somebody killed a family member, all they did is deprived you of your property. And that idea leads to all sorts of other evil. It leads to the idea that human beings can be treated as property. And you can't allow human beings to be treated as property. Even if it means that by doing so, you will, so to speak, save the life of the murderer, that's not kedai. In this balancing, it's not kedai. Because you can't allow people to believe that human life is just property. You can't allow them to believe that slaves are just property. You can't allow them to believe that sons or daughters are just property, and that therefore, if they disgrace the family, that the family is entitled to kill them. You can't allow people to engage and those practices, those ancient pagan practices, persist to this day. And that's why Torah was so insistent that we not confuse human life with property. Now, so that's sort of one piece. Then there's a second piece. The second element that I want to look at is the issue of vicarious punishment. So I made reference just before to this, the passages in virtually every ancient legal system that have to do with people being put to death for the crimes of others. Right, so I point out in Hammurabi's code, for example, paragraph 116, or even in a more extreme manner in Hammurabi's code, that I include this. Paragraphs 229. Take a look at the left-hand column, paragraphs 229 and 230. If a builder build a house in Hammurabi's code, a house for anyone, and do not build it solid, and the house which he built fall down and kill the owner, one should put that builder to death. If it kill a son of the owner of the house, one should put to death the son of the builder. Well, what's the difference who got killed? Right? I mean, the criminal was the contractor who built a building that, some things never disappear in society, right? I mean, how many decades ago was it only that wedding hall collapsed and killed like 40 people in along the coast in Israel, right? I mean, it's unfortunate, the bridge collapsing, right? I mean, the bridges that were built up in Meron, were any of those contractors eventually tried for the crimes? All right, in any case, it's a realistic phenomenon. It existed in, right, 4,000 years, almost 5,000 years ago, it existed already in Hammurabi's code, understood that sometimes builders do that. So what do you do when a builder does that? So says Hammurabi's code, well, I mean, if it killed the homeowner, so then the builder should die, right? But if it killed the son of the homeowner, then the son of the builder should die. Why? Well, so on the first level, well, it's obvious because the son of the householder is property, belongs to the homeowner. And therefore, the builder damaged the property of the homeowner, and therefore the equivalent property of the builder has to suffer the consequence, right? And so we refer to that as sort of vicarious punishment, right? It's not the person who committed the crime who's punished. Somebody else is punished for the commission of that crime, right? And the same thing was true the same thing was true even in late Roman law, right? Take a look at the bottom right hand column, right? This is late Roman law, the Institute's Book 1, Law of Persons, Title 9, Patria Potestas. What's Patria Potestas? Patria Potestas is the absolute power of the pater, of the father of the house, the father of the household, his absolute power over the lives of every member of the family. And in Roman law, that absolute power extended to taking the life of any family member for any reason. The family members included not only children, but included wives. Right? I mean, so take a look at the language. It's really, and take a look at the sense of pride with which Roman jurists declared, right? In paragraph 2, the legal power which we have over our children is peculiar to Roman citizens. For no other men have the power over their children that we have. And the truth is that was not true, is only out of their ignorance of the laws of many other Western and Eastern societies that they declare that. But nevertheless, the child born to you and to your wife is in your power. Also the child born to your son and his wife, that is your grandson and your granddaughter and your great-grandchild and so forth. But a child born to your daughter is not in your power because that child is in the power of the child's father, right? It's patria potestas. And vicarious punishment was known in virtually every society. Right? I mean, we don't have to think about sort of modern contexts in which oppressive governments would take hostages and declare that if the oppressed did not do what they wanted, that they would kill all of the hostages. What does it mean to kill all of the hostages for what the society, ladies society, considered to be a criminal action, right? It means, right? And the reality is that this is a tendency that is, it's sort of almost an instinctive tendency, right? And I mean, Israel struggles with the same thing to this day around the issue of destruction of houses, right? I mean, Baruch Hashem, Israel has no one there, I shouldn't say no one, but you know, it has not been viewed as defensible in Israel for people to suggest that the families of terrorists should be slaughtered because of the terrorists' action, right? But it has been suggested and implemented that the homes in which the families of terrorists live, in which the terrorists also live, should also suffer the loss of the house. Why? Because this intuition that human beings have that the family must have some kind of a share in the wrongdoing. And after all, it's a single family, so we should punish the family unit, not just punish the individual member of the family, is a very powerful human intuition. And the Torah clearly set out to combat that intuition. And that's why, right, in verse 24, the Torah says, Lo yumtu avot al banim, banim lo yumtu al avotam, ish bechet o yumat. Ish bechet o yumat. What does it mean? It means that the Torah is stating with absolute, unequivocal declarative statement that human beings do not have the authority to punish anyone but the perpetrator. Anyone but the perpetrator. Only the perpetrator can be punished by human beings. And I mean, it was that of course, the extent of that, was the subject of debate between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai early in 2,000 years ago, around the question of what that law means in regard to collaborators, right? Or for that matter, someone who hires someone else to commit a homicide. So if the principal, right, the person who hires somebody, hires a person who is his agent, and he pays the person $10,000 to go assassinate somebody, and then the agent executes his agency exactly as he was instructed, and he kills the victim. The question is, who is liable for that death? Who can be tried and executed for that death? So Beit Shammai said, in accordance with standard laws of causation, sort of but-for causation, the whole world understands there is such a thing as human responsibility, which is built on the premise that if this effect would not have occurred but for your action, then you are considered the cause of that consequence. And therefore, said Beit Shammai, in that situation, not only the perpetrator, but the principal who hired him, both of them should be put to death. And Beit Hillel said, wait a second. The Torah says, Ish bechet o yumat. Ish bechet o yumat. Ish bechet o yumat means, said Beit Hillel, that only the perpetrator can be put to death, not the person who caused him to do it. It's true, said Beit Hillel, if an adult had convinced a child to commit a homicide, then the person who engaged the agent would in fact be liable, because a child is not capable of agency, of autonomous judgment, and therefore the child is, so to speak, yado, is the direct hand of the principal. But otherwise, if the principal is an adult, if the agent is an adult, then it's the agent's responsibility to understand that that's a criminal action that he's not allowed to do. And therefore, said Beit Hillel, it's only the agent who commits the act who is to be put to death. The principal cannot be put to death. Now, the principal, even according to Beit Hillel, can be convicted of a crime. But the crime that he can be convicted of is what? Because he obviously knew that this agent he was hiring was someone who was in fact likely to commit this homicide. And he, by offering him this money, was engaged in the crime of inducing someone else to commit a crime. And that itself is a crime according to the Torah. It is the crime of lifnei iver lo titei mechshol, which Chazal understood not to mean literally placing a stumbling block before the blind. It was the crime of inducing someone who was morally blind to commit a crime. So why that insistence? Because Beit Hillel understood that this principle of not allowing the society to engage in vicarious punishment was a fundamental principle of Torah. Even though there are arguably two instances in which the Torah's own legislation allows that kind of apparent vicarious punishment. Right? What are those two instances? What comes to mind? I'm sure people have asked you about that. If not yet, then someday when you're in leading a congregation, people will ask you about it. How can you say, the Torah says, how can you implement this other penalty when the Torah says, lo yimtu avot banim al avotam? They are the penalty of mamzerut of a child born. Mamzerut of a child born of incest or adultery. The changed status of the child is fundamentally a penalty for the crime that was committed by the parents. It's no wonder that Chazal, for millennia, have expended their efforts to reduce the incidents in which it would be necessary to determine that a child was a mamzer. Why? Because they understood. Really? If you want to punish the parents, punish the parents. But to allow the child to then suffer for the rest of the life of the child by having an impaired status? Really? That's an issue. As I said, we'll get in the second half, we'll take a closer look at this kind of issue. Why the Torah would in fact allow that to take place. Right? The other element of apparent vicarious punishment that is present in Torah is the mandate in relation to an Ir Nidachat, a city which had in its whole, all of the entire city engaged in idolatry, that if a family had engaged in idolatry and that family was tried, every adult member of the family was tried and convicted of idolatry, that minor children also had to be killed. That's what the Torah says. And it's a second instance, the only two, I believe, in the whole of the Torah, where you have any kind of intimation even of vicarious punishment. But
Rabbi Berman.
There are a couple of people on a common line. Yes, Lara. I can't hear you. You're muted. You're still muted, Lara. Yeah.
Okay. What about the prohibitions on marrying a Moabite?
Yeah.
For instance, that the sort of generational prohibitions on these are groups of people that Jews are not allowed to marry based on things that.
Okay. All right, fine. And we'll take a look at that as well. I don't view that as a form of punishment, but we'll take a look at that as well. All right, so in any case, so that's sort of the second area that I wanted us to look at. Then there's a third area. The third area is the area of freedom. So it is clear that the Torah allowed two different forms of the institution of slavery to continue to exist within biblical society and within Jewish society. And it wasn't until 1500 years after Matan Torah that Jewish society essentially eliminated both of those institutions of slavery. One was the Torah allowed for the continuation of a form of slavery, more properly of indentured servitude, in regard to fellow Jews, right? So how would a Jew become an indentured servant? So what's the meaning of indentured servitude? How is that different from slavery? The Torah uses the word eved, sometimes in regard to eved va'ama, in regard to indentured servitude. So what is indentured servitude? Indentured servitude is a situation in which a person, through one or another circumstance, owed a debt, most commonly in consequence of criminality, of criminal theft. Let's say an accountant, sort of cooked the books and stole, a couple of $100,000, and then was caught, and he couldn't pay back because he had gambled away all of the money. So he had no money to pay $200,000 that he owed. So the Torah allows him to be, quote unquote, sold into indentured servitude for a maximum of how long? Of 6 years. And why did the Torah do that? So that the money that was paid up front for his service for those 6 years could be used to pay the victim of his crime, right? And that's part of a broader pattern in biblical criminal law, in which the central purpose of biblical criminal law is making the victim whole. Making the victim whole is more important than the penalty to the person of the criminal. And so in this way, at least if the person's services can't bring in the $200,000, nevertheless, they will sell his services for a maximum of 6 years. If someone is willing to purchase his services, for example, for $50,000 a year, then they would sell him for only 4 years. And they would get $200,000. They would pay the victim of the crime, and then the person would remain a servant for only 4 years. During those years, the servant and his entire family would be supported by and live within the home of his purchaser. And the Torah insists that he is only allowed, that the master, quote unquote, is only allowed to utilize his services for things that he is capable of doing. You're not permitted to place upon him sort of avodat perach. We'll look at avodat perach a little bit more later on. It's appropriate for almost Erev Pesach. And the master is duty bound to support the family, for that entire period of time. Not allowed to beat him, right? I mean, if he beats him up, right? If he beats him up and breaks his nose, what's the law of an Eved Ivri? If a master beats up his Eved Ivri and breaks his nose, what's the law? I can't hear you, Rose.
He goes free.
No, doesn't go free. That's the law for an Eved Knaani. For an Eved Knaani, a non-Jewish slave, if the master beats him, right, because there you really needed a much stronger deterrent. You needed, in relation to the non-Jewish slave, you needed a much stronger deterrent to physical abuse of the slave. And so the Torah provides, in relation to a non-Jewish slave, if you beat him up, you break his nose, he goes free. But if you beat up and you break the nose of a Jew, then what happens? He sues you. because he's a citizen. He's still, right? He may be an indentured servant, but he's still, he can sue you, right? I mean, that's why, we are a litigious people. There's no question that he'll sue you, right? He'll sue you and then you'll pay Nezek and Tsar and Ripu and Shivas and Boshes. You'll have to pay all of those. But right, so the Torah allowed that institution to remain, but at the end of the 6 years, he has to go free. It's not in the Shemitah year that he goes free. He goes free in the end of his 6th year of servitude, the Eved Ivri. By contrast, the Torah did allow the existence of a form of slavery that's referred to as Eved Knaani. And the Eved Knaani was in fact an Eved Olam. He remained a slave for all of his life. And his offspring remained slaves. If his wife was also a slave, then his offspring also remained slaves all of his life. And they could be inherited, so to speak, by the next generation. But the Torah sort of humanized that whole process by making it clear that you may own the slave's service, but you don't own his body. And therefore, you cannot control, you cannot beat him, you cannot abuse him, and you can't compel him to do avodat perach. You can't compel him to do meaningless labor, demeaning labor, because right. So you have to treat him humanely, but it allowed for the continuation of that institution of slavery. But come back for a moment to Eved Ivri. So stay with Eved Knaani for a moment. So even in regard to Eved Knaani, the institution of Eved Knaani was completely modified, precisely because even though Chazal use the phrase of kinyan guf, kinyan aguf, right? Chazal use that phrase in relation to the Eved Knaani, that the owner of the Eved Knaani has kinyan aguf, has ownership of the body, right? Yeah, he has ownership of the body. And he can keep him on as a slave, and he can use him as a slave, but he can't beat him, and he can't require him to do labor that is demeaning. And on top of which, the slave has to be willing to accept mitzvot in order to remain a slave in the home of a Jew. To Chazal, this was clear. You couldn't have a member of a Jewish household who was not chayav b'mitzvot. Even an Eved Knaani had to be chayav b'mitzvot in order to be a member of the Jewish household, which meant that he had to accept, as it were, not quite conversion, but a shift in his status to Eved Knaani. Eved Knaani is sort of the closest status that a non-Jew can hold in proximity to being a Jew. So it's true, he cannot be chayav in more mitzvot than women are chayav in. But he can be chayav in mitzvot like women are chayav in. And therefore, he has to observe Shabbat, and he can't be your Shabbos guy. Your slave cannot be your Shabbos guy, because he is also chayav to observe Shabbos. And he is entitled to rest on Shabbos and all of the Yom Tovim, just like you are. Which means that fundamentally the institution of Eved Knaani was transformed into making someone into a non-Jewish, technically member of a Jewish household, who is bound by all of the duties and some rights that a member of a Jewish household is entitled to. He's not simply a piece of property. You can't view him that way. And the Torah went further, even in relation to non-Jewish slaves who were owned by non-Jews. And the Torah provides that if a non-Jewish slave owned by non-Jews runs away from his master, his non-Jewish master, and he flees to Eretz Yisrael, and there in Eretz Yisrael, suddenly he shows up as a freed slave, as someone who has escaped slavery. So the Torah, what's the Torah's provision in relation to that situation? That you are not permitted to return him to his owner. Why not? Because he is not property. right? Despite this unfortunate usage by Chazal of the notion of kinyan aguf, he is not property. He's a human being. And if he has escaped from his master, then you don't have a duty to make that master whole. You may have a duty to make that master whole in relation to other forms of his property, but you don't have a duty to return a freed slave. And on top of that, in relation to the Jewish servant, at the end of the 6 years he goes free, correct? But the Torah has this strange provision related to a slave who goes free at the end of the 6th year. Says the Torah, what happens if at the end of the 6th year, the master says to the servant, to the indentured servant, this Jewish indentured servant, he says to him, listen, you've already worked off the money that I paid for you. So now it's time for you to leave. Go out, set up your own home. I'll even provide you with a grub stake, right, with the starting funds, right, because it's obvious to Torah that you can't now take him and send him out into the real world without any means to support himself. So he has to have some interim funding. So you're obligated to provide him with that interim funding, says the Torah. But you have to go free. So what if, says the Torah, the servant says, oh, go free. Ahavti et Adoni. I mean, I love my master. I love the conditions of my life. You're supporting myself, my family, my everybody. We have a comfortable place to live. And after all, I'm a thief being released from prison, so to speak. So really, in this economic environment, you want me to go out and look for a job as an accountant? What, are you kidding? Nobody's going to hire me now, right? I just got out of prison, right? So it's a wonderful prison. I want to stay here. I want to remain an Eved. Let's negotiate a salary. I'll even negotiate a lower salary. Let's negotiate something. I want to remain an Eved. What's the halacha in that situation? What does the Torah say in that situation? What is the halacha? So the Torah says that what?
The year.
Wait a second. Torah says something slightly before it mentions the ear. Before it mentions the ear, it says he has to be brought someplace. Where does he have to be brought?
To the doorpost, the mezuzah.
I thought the Beit Din, no?
He has to be brought to the Beit Din. He has to be brought to the Shar Ha'ir. Why the Shar Ha'ir? Because that's where the Beit Din sat. Why does he have to be brought to Beit Din? He has to be brought to Beit Din. It's obvious. Chazal understood why he had to be brought to Beit Din. He had to be brought to Beit Din because you had to establish that this was really what he wanted. Otherwise, it's possible that the master was coercing him to remain on as a slave. So if the Beit Din determined that he really wanted that and he, intended to remain a slave, then the Beit Din was entitled to say, okay, you can stay on as a slave until when? Until Yovel. Whenever the Yovel happens to come out, then you're going to have to go free. No matter, Yovel is 4 years from now, you go free for Yovel is 40 years from now. Okay, so you can have a long stretch, right? But you're going to go out in Yovel. There has to be a terminus. There has to be an ending point to this period of slavery. You can't be an Eved Olam. Why can't you not be an Eved Olam? Because the only one you're an Eved Olam to is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then they pierce his ear. Why do they pierce his ear? So Rashi comments, right? It's based on the Midrash. What does the Midrash say? And Rashi quotes right on the spot. Why do they pierce his ear? Because Ozen sheshama bahar Sinai avadayheim v'lo avadim la'avadim. Right? Ozen sheshama bahar Sinai, that Hashem said to Am Yisrael that you are my avadim, not avadim to other avadim, and you want to remain an eved to other avadim? That's wrong. You shouldn't want to remain an eved to other avadim. And so you pierce the ear. Okay, interesting. So I have a gloss to suggest on that practice of the piercing of the ear. It's the very last paragraph of Hammurabi's code. Paragraph 282, it's right here at the bottom of that first column in Hammurabi's code. The slaves say to his master, "You are not my master." That is, a slave runs away. And the master catches up with him and he grabs him. And And the master says, you're my slave, come back into servitude. And this person who he grabs says, what are you talking about? I'm not your slave. I'm a free citizen. So what's the law? So law according to Hammurabi's code is that there's a burden of proof that rests in fact upon the master to prove that this man is his slave. So let's assume that he proves that he's his slave, right? He produces DNA evidence to prove this is really my slave, no question about it. Proves he's his slave. So what's the law then? Says Hammurabi's code, if the master proves him to be his slave, he may cut off his ear. So in Hammurabi's code, right? Remember, Hammurabi's code was essentially the common law of the ancient Near East. It was the equivalent of what the common law was at one time for much of the world, right? So in Hammurabi's code, what can you do? You cut off the ear. So why in Hammurabi's code do you cut off the ear? Cutting off the ear in Hammurabi's code is the penalty for what? Penalty for what? Right? It's obvious where I'm headed on this, right? Is the penalty for what? Is the penalty for desiring to be free, for attempting to escape from slavery. So Torah uses a similar penalty. The Torah very often is responsive to the to the legal and cultural reality of the ancient world, right? So says the Torah, yeah, well, punishment in the ear. Okay, so I'm not going to cut off the whole ear, just going to pierce the ear. I am told that, right, the piercing of the ear was then the symbol, right, of permanent and not permanent, but enslavement. It was a symbol of enslavement, right? That's why Jewish women to this day do not practice piercing of the ears, right? Because it's a symbol of enslavement, right? Everybody knows that. And I was able to convince our older daughter of that she couldn't couldn't pierce ears until after she got married. But the day after she got married, her ears got pierced. In any case, the piercing of the ear was the symbol of enslavement, right? The symbol of enslavement. So why does the Torah do that? Because in the Torah, why is the person's ear pierced? Right? It has taken the symbolic act of Hammurabi's code and completely inverted its meaning. The piercing of the ear, a punishment in the ear because you refuse to become free. This is a person who refused to become free. He has to be marked as someone who refused to accept the responsibilities of his freedom. That is, what the Torah has done, both in regard to Eved Knani and in regard to Eved Ivri, is to say, okay, we're going to allow these institutions to remain. We're going to allow them to remain at this point in time. We'll humanize them as far as we can. We will humanize these institutions. We will not allow, Jews to view their slaves as property. We will not allow them to think that they can beat them at their will and do anything that they want to them. But it needs to be clear that this is fundamentally a compromise with the reality, that this is not the intent of Torah, that the ultimate goal that we aspire to is the goal of freedom, not the preservation of slavery, but the goal of freedom. And then one final piece that I would like to look at in this sort of picture of the way in which the Torah sort of this, what I'm arguing is sort of the countercultural character of the fundamental values that Torah is propounding here, right? A principle of the absolute value of every human life, of the elimination of vicarious punishment in the justice system, of the insistence on the value of freedom. And one final element, and that is the notion of the duty of rescue. And here, this is part of a broader issue that I won't explicate fully, but I'll be glad to answer other kinds of questions about it. The Torah, in regard to virtually all forms of crime, crimes against life, crimes against the body, crimes against property, crimes against emotional well-being, and crimes against spiritual identity. Those are sort of the 5 fundamental categories of criminality in the Torah's legal system. right? Crimes against life, crimes against health, against the body, crimes against property, crimes against emotional well-being, and crimes against spiritual identity. In every one of those areas, the Torah forbids injury. It forbids a Jew to engage in an action which constitutes a direct assault, so to speak, on that human interest. And I argue that in every one of those instances, the nature of Torah's prohibition is universal. So the Torah's prohibition against taking life is a universal. Doesn't matter whether the victim is a Jew or a non-Jew. Doesn't matter whether the victim is a non-Jew who is not an who is an Oved Avodah Zarah or is not an Oved Avodah Zarah. Doesn't matter. Again, while the Torah permits the taking of the lives of persons in war, right? But it's the criminality of the taking of human life doesn't know of a distinction between Jew and non-Jew. And the same thing is true with regard to injury to the body of another person. The Torah's prohibition against injury to the body of another person does not know distinctions between Jew and non-Jew. The prohibition against assault is a prohibition which is applicable to every person, and that's why Chazal understood, for example, that even in Noachite law, the prohibition against taking life encompassed also the prohibition against injury to persons, because it was inconceivable to them that even within Noachite law, that it's not prohibited to injure a person, to cut off somebody's arm, right? To poke out somebody's eye, because those were forms of life interest. I'm interested for another reason in separating between the two, but fundamentally that notion that the human life and the human body, you're not permitted to act in a manner that directly causes injury to another person by eliminating their life or by injuring their body. But that the same thing is true in regard to the property of persons. That is, that lo tignovu, which is the basis of the prohibition against theft of property, does not only apply to the property of Jews, that it applies equally to the property of non-Jews. And it does, and the Rambam unequivocally, so you'll tell me, well, but maybe Toasak Meinu Choser, right? I'll get to that maybe, but but the fundamental law that theft is theft, it doesn't matter whether you're stealing from a Jew, you're stealing from a non-Jew, stealing from a person is forbidden. You're not allowed to do that kind, right? That these are universals. And that the same thing is true fundamentally in regard also to emotional wrongs. And the same thing is true fundamentally in regard to spiritual identity. And that's why the criminality, for example, of economic acts which are criminalized by Torah fundamentally because they are emotional wrongs, like, for example, oshek, like the withholding payment to people. Withholding payment to people, said Chazal, is not only a crime in relation to Jewish employees, it's a crime in relation also to anyone. Why? Because what the emotional well-being of another person should be free for you to assault? It can't be. And Gnevas Das, and Onas Dvarim, and this whole network of laws that involve economic relationships, but where the motive of the criminalization of a particular action is because fundamentally of the emotional wrong that it does to another person, those are universals. And in regard to even people's spiritual well-being, Chazal insisted that lifnei iver lo titein michshol, this prohibition against causing somebody else to commit a crime, causing someone else to act in a manner that is spiritually wrongful, that is destructive of their spiritual identity, is usher, whether it's to a Jew or a non-Jew. Right? That's why the two classic instances, wherever the sugya of Lifnei Iver arises, the two classical instances of illustrations of Lifnei Iver, Lotita, and Michshol is one, bringing yayin to a Nazir, thereby enabling the Nazir to violate his Nazirut, right? Because he has taken a vow of being a Nazir, and he's not allowed to drink wine. And if he doesn't have wine available to him, and you bring wine to him, and you make it then possible for him to commit this crime, this spiritual wrong, that's you have then committed this crime of Lifnei V'lo Titen Michshol. And what's the second illustration of that for Chazal? The second illustration is Iver min HaChai ben Noach. Because Noachites are forbidden, they don't have to eat kosher, right? But they are forbidden to eat a limb torn from a living animal, right? Because they too are commanded that they have to have sensitivity to the pain, to the suffering of a living being. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed us to shecht animals, right? But he's not going to allow us to cause extreme pain and suffering to animals, right? We can kill the animal by shechita, but we can't just cut, and which in the ancient world, this was common, the cutting a limb from a living animal. Why was it common in the ancient world? That is, if you wanted to have a steak, you would cut out a piece of the side of the animal and you would cook it up and you have a steak. And the next time you want a steak, you cut it out of the other flank. And the third time you cut it out of a third flank, right? I mean, you keep cutting out pieces until the animal is on the verge of death, and then you kill it and you make a party, and right? Why would they do that? They would do that because they didn't have refrigerators. They didn't have ways of preserving meat for long term, particularly not shepherds who were out in the fields, right? They didn't have a way of preserving meat. So how did you eat meat? You wanted to eat meat? How did you eat meat? You ate meat by doing that act of cruelty to the animal. Said the Torah, no, even Bnei Noach, no human being is justified in causing that kind of pain to animals, except corporate human beings, right? I mean, in America, corporations are legal persons, and therefore legal persons can cause unlimited pain to animals without anybody caring about it until somebody, starts yelling about it, right? But this, you're right, you can't do that, correct? And so said Chazal, if a Jew provides a part of an Iver min HaChai to a non-Jew, then that is destructive of the spiritual identity of that non-Jew. You're not entitled to do that, right? So across every area of criminality, the law of the Torah is fundamentally universal in terms of direct wrongdoing. But there's yet another layer in each of these areas of wrongdoing that the Torah teaches us about. Because in each of these areas of wrongdoing, the Torah tells us as Jews, not only that we may not do direct wrong to people, but in each of these areas, the Torah tells us that we have a legal duty of rescue. The legal duty of rescue is not always necessarily universal. In some areas, it's universal. In other areas, it's not universal. And yet other areas, it's debate around the question of its universality. So, for example, in regard to life, the Torah is quite unequivocal, at least as Chazal understand the Torah. The Torah says, Lo tamarol dam re'echa. You may not stand idly by the death of a neighbor. And they understand that whenever the Torah uses the word re'acha, even though there is some debate about this issue in the early literature, and particularly in Midrashei Halacha, there are a number of instances in the word in which the Chazal specifically assign universal meaning to the word re'acha, but in the final event, they accepted la halacha that re'acha creates a legal duty in relation to fellow Jews, and that therefore lo tamer al dam re'acha creates a legal duty for the rescue if another Jew is in a situation in which his or her life is at risk, that we have a legal duty to attempt to rescue. Of course, we ought not do that at significant risk to ourselves, but assuming that one can intervene without significant risk to oneself, there's a legal duty of rescue, right? Now, that very notion that there is a legal duty of rescue by an unattached person, by a person who does not have a specific relationship to the possible victim, is virtually unknown in the history of law. There have been a number of societies. France, under the Napoleonic Code, introduced the legal duty of rescue, which it did not enforce in any way. But nevertheless, it was there. Roman law had no legal duty, no ancient legal system had a legal duty of rescue. Roman law had no legal duty of rescue. Common law, British common law, had no legal duty of rescue. American law does not embody a federal legal duty of rescue. And in the whole of the 50 states of the United States, there are only 5 states that create a legal duty of rescue. So there are only 5 states in which if you're sitting at the side of a pool, just relaxing, and you suddenly, somebody calls out from the middle of the pool, calling for help because they're drowning. And you're just sitting there, but you're an expert swimmer. You're not the lifeguard, right? If you were the lifeguard there, you would have a legal duty of rescue. You're not a police officer who has a legal duty of rescue. You're not a parent of the child who would have a legal duty of rescue because of the relationship between you. You're just a citizen is sitting there. There are only 5 states in the United States in which if you continue to sit there because you don't want to get your clothes wet, but you would have with ease the capacity to rescue that person's life, and you sit it out and the person dies, there are only 5 states in which you will have committed any kind of a wrong. And then each of those 5 states, it's a misdemeanor. It's a misdemeanor for which there is a monetary fine ranging between $300 and $600. That's it. And the Torah, 3,500 years ago, said, what, are you out of your mind? You should be entitled. You should be entitled to sit there and not get your clothes wet when someone's life is at stake. That's what it means for there to be a legal duty of rescue. Question is, to whom is that applicable? So the Ramban, Moshe ben Nachman, so the Ramban says, wait a second, says the Ramban. It's true, Losan al Dam Reyecha is the basis of the existence of a legal duty of rescue for Jews, but there's another pasuk in the Torah that creates an equivalent legal duty of rescue. And that is the pasuk in Vayikra 25:35 of Ger v'toshav v'chai imach. That is, the pasuk of Ger v'toshav v'chai imach, says the Ramban, creates a legal duty of rescue to whom? Toward every Ger Toshav. What's the meaning of Ger Toshav? Ger Toshav, by the time of the Ramban, had an unequivocal understanding, which everyone understood. It meant the non-idolatrous non-Jew. That was already understanding that was embedded in Chazal, in the Sugyos in the Gemara. It was clear that Ger Toshav had multiple meanings. Ger Toshav meant the resident alien who was living in a Jewish state. But the term Ger Toshav was also a reference to the non-idolatrous non-Jew. Says the Ramban, we have a legal duty of rescue, midoraita, for the life of a non-idolatrous non-Jew because of this pasuk of Ger v'toshav v'chai imach. And he criticizes the Rambam for not listing that as a separate mitzvah aseh. Right? The Rambam does not list this pasuk of Ger v'toshav v'chai imach, which the Ramban understands means that the Ger Toshav chai imach, you have a legal duty to enable him to live, to continue living amongst you, because you have a legal duty to rescue his life. So the Megillat Esther, you're all familiar with the Megillat Esther in his commentary to the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvot, and he undertook in his commentary to the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvot to offer a defense whenever the Ramban criticized the Rambam in his listing of the mitzvot. The Megillat Esther offers a defense. So what's his defense? The truth of the matter is that his defense makes an enormous amount of sense. Says Megillat Esther, it's not that the Rambam believes that you don't have a legal duty of rescue toward a ger toshav. You have a legal duty of rescue also toward the non-idolatrous non-Jew. On what basis? Says Megillat Esther, according to the Rambam, you have that duty not based on v'chai imach in the pasuk, but based on the legal duty of the inclusion of ger toshav in the mitzvah of tzedakah. Because according to the Rambam, the mitzvah of tzedakah encompasses every situation, not only of someone's need for money, but the need for bodily well-being and the preservation of life, which is why the Rambam includes pidyon shvuyim as the prime instance of tzedakah. And that's why, according to the Rambam, the Gemara in Bava Batra asserts that the mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim is gadol b'chulam, is the greatest, is mitzvah rabbah, ein lacha mitzvah rabbah ka pidyon shvuyim. What is the mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim, according to the Rambam? It's the mitzvah of tzedakah. Because the mitzvah of tzedakah is to provide people with food and clothing and shelter. What is that all about? It's about, says the Megillat Esther, it's clear, that's all about maintaining their lives. So clearly you have, and that duty clearly encompasses the ger toshav. In fact, according to the Rambam, that's the understanding of the takana in the Mishnah in Gittin, when the Mishnah says that you cannot withhold leket shikha and peah even from oved avodah zara, even from idolaters. That's because the Rambam maintains that the mitzvah of tzedakah in fact extends even to idolaters, which means that according to the Megillat Esther, the Rambam in effect goes even further than the Ramban does in regard to the universality of this mitzvah of rescue, of this duty of rescue of life, that the duty of rescue of life may or may not be perfectly universal. There may be people, or as the Meiri would put it, there may still be people somewhere in the world whose lifestyles are so totally corrupt that we have no duties toward them. They are outlaws in the old sense of outlaws, right? In my Western movies sense of outlaws, right? Where they post a sign that says outlaw. You know what outlaw means? That someone is not subject to the protection of the law. If someone is declared to be an outlaw, it means they are not subject to the protection of the law. And therefore, if somebody sees them, they can just kill them on sight. There's no further judicial process needed, right? So Torah never went so far as to declare that there were people whom you could just kill on sight, stam, because he or she is an outlaw. That principle doesn't even apply to Amalek, let alone to Sheva Umos. It doesn't apply to them. There's no such law in the Torah. Even for them, it's only within the context of the military battle that you can take their lives. But, so one way or another, the notion of the universal or close to universality of this duty of rescue of life, and therefore also of health and well-being, because certainly according to the Rambam, that's all of that is included in the duty of tzedakah, which is fundamentally the duty to assure the physical, material well-being and safety and security of every individual. That's applicable to everybody. On the other hand, it's not so clear that this duty of rescue is universally applicable in regard to property. And there was intense debate. That is, what's an example of the universe? What's an example of the legal duty of rescue in relation to property? Again, which is unique in the annals of law, absolutely unique in the annals of law. The mitzvah of Hashavat Aveidah. Did you ever stop and think about that? Well, what does the mitzvah of Hashavat Aveidah say? The mitzvah of Hashavat Aveidah says that if you see someone's property that's lost, that you have a legal duty to stop, pick it up, and attempt to return it to its owner. So it's true, there are other factors involved there. It depends who you are and what you're doing and what, there are competing factors that need to be taken into account. But assuming that there's no significant loss to you, you have a legal duty to return that property. And that notion of the legal duty of securing the property of other persons pertains not only to lost property, it also pertains to property that is at threat, right? So that's why the Torah says if you see an animal having collapsed under its burden, that you have a legal duty to help. So on one hand, you have a legal duty to protect the animal, right? But even after you've unloaded everything, so the animal is no longer suffering, then you have a further duty. You've done prikah, but you now have an additional duty, the duty of te'ina. What's the duty of te'ina? Now, this person, the owner of this animal, still needs to get all of these goods to the marketplace. And he's standing there and he can't load the animal by himself. So he's going to lose out on a day's stuff of marketing. He may even lose more. So you stand under a legal duty to help him reload his animal. Why? Because you have a legal responsibility, according to Torah, for the economic well-being of this other person. This other person's property is at risk, and you have the capacity without significant risk to yourself to rescue him in that situation, then you have a legal duty to do that. In regard to that, there's intense debate amongst Chachamim around the question of whether that legal duty extends also to non-Jews. And one can understand that, the Chachamim may have seen that they did not see that needed to be universal. It's one thing for life and health, but really I have to bear the responsibility for the economic security and safety of every human being I come across. So as far as Jews are concerned, there was no question in the mind of the Chachamim that you have a legal duty of rescue. So for example, in their mind, if a storm was predicted, and so you surrounded your house with sandbags to prevent the flood from coming into your house, and then you suddenly realized that your neighbor was away on some kind of a trip, and that they probably didn't even realize that there was a storm predicted, and that they had not protected their house, and you had both the means and the time to be able to sandbag their house as well, then you stand under a legal duty to do that, right? So if you see your neighbor's door unlocked and sort of swinging open, and you realize that the neighbor probably didn't leave it that way, then you have a responsibility to act on that and to call the neighbor and say, your front door is open, I close it. That is, if you have the capacity to rescue someone in their economic well-being, then you have a legal duty of rescue in relation to them according to Torah. Right? Now, so is that universal? So the dominant position of Chazal was that is not universal. On the other hand, if your failure to do that would be discerned as a bias against non-Jews and could then cause non-Jews to view you as immoral people. Why so? Because they might feel not that you are legally obligated, but that it's the morally right thing to do and that you did not do the morally right thing. And therefore they would view you as someone with demeaned morality, that you as a Jew, that, said Chazal, that would be a chil Hashem. And in order to avoid that, you are then obligated to do that which is morally right. If non-Jews have the same moral sensibility about that as you do, even if they don't view it as legally obligatory, if they would then view you as immoral for having failed to do that, then that's a chil Hashem. And then you're obligated to do that in any case, right? So, that one way or another, and by contrast, remember that according to the Meiri and the approach of the Meiri to all of this, these obligations related to to life and body and property and emotions and spiritual, and all of these are fundamentally equally applicable. According to the Meiri, these are equally applicable, right? That's why I said these are very often areas of debate amongst Rishonim to every civilized human being. Because every civilized human being will understand that it's morally appropriate to do that kind of action. And therefore you're not relieved from your moral responsibility just because the halacha didn't require you to do it. Then the same thing is true with regard to issues of emotions and spiritual identity, right? There's in each of these areas, there is a duty of rescue. And I mean, in the context of emotional well-being, it's sort of manifest in the impermissibility of even receiving lashon hara. Right, lashon hara is fundamentally an emotional crime. It's a crime against the emotions of another person. And when Chazal say that the isur of lashon hara also embodies the impermissibility of listening to it, what they're saying is that you have a duty to prevent that spread, right? That's a piece of the legal duty of rescue in regard to emotional well-being. And even in regard to spiritual well-being. Chazal understand that it's the case that the critical element of prevention of wrongdoing, of spiritual wrongdoing, is mandated. The wrongdoing is mandated through lifnei iver. You shouldn't be complicit in the wrongdoing. The duty of rescue is manifest in tochacha. Tochacha is the legal duty of the rescue of the spiritual well-being of another person. Now, obviously, tochacha, as Chazal understood it already, is an art form. Tochacha doesn't mean, walking around with big signs saying repent, right? Tochacha means that if you love a person, that you have a legal responsibility to approach that person to say, I can't believe that you could do that. Tell me you didn't do it. Tell me I'm misunderstanding. Explain to me how you would have come to do that. And that it's only tochacha out of ahava that can work. But nevertheless, that tochacha applies in any situation. That's why the two psukim are linked. That's why the psukim of Lifnei Velo Titei Mechshol is further linked to tochacha, because that kind of tochacha we need to exercise in any situation in which we have the capacity to prevent someone from engaging in spiritual wrongdoing. This is a layer of moral responsibility. This notion of the duty of rescue, it's a layer of moral responsibility which runs through the entire fabric of the Torah and is virtually unique in the annals of human history, not unique in the sense of unique as a moral awareness. There's a lot of moral awareness of this. Any moral human being will tell you that it's a good thing to do to prevent someone from drowning. It's a good thing to do to, right? I mean, the good Samaritan is a good thing to do, to be a good Samaritan, to help somebody. But Torah doesn't leave it to the moral drive. Torah legislates that for us. And so that's the piece that I was going to explore in the latter half of this, which, I mean, if you give me permission, I'll sort of explore this other issue at the beginning of our next session together in order to be able to tie all of this together. Is that okay with everybody? Because I think that it's critical that you understand from the perspective of this approach, what it is that's in this relationship between law and morality, right? Why is it that Torah is so insistent on embodying these into legal rules, right? And what does it mean for us to view that as these as laws? And what does it mean about these exceptional areas? Why do there seem to be these exceptions in each of these areas? So that's what I'll try to do at the first part of our meeting next time. Okay, and then we'll try to move on to that other issue that we're supposed to talk about, having to do with the relationship to Israel. Okay, between